Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our National Conversation. This is a podcast where we have respectful dialogue on policy issues. We're not policy experts per se, but we do believe that having dialogue intended to understand perspectives with which we disagree makes for a much more interesting conversation and much more productive one than what we normally see in political media today, where partisan rhetoric and making the other side just look as dumb as possible is prioritized above actively seeking understanding there. So we have a pretty exciting conversation today. We're going to be talking about the Department of Education, some really big policy moves there recently. And, I myself, in case you don't know, my name is Sam Taylor. I'm the host of this podcast. I am currently the Chief Operating Officer at Our National Conversation, the nonprofit that this podcast is associated with. And I'm joined today by Tania Ruedas Ortiz, who has been on the podcast a few times and certainly has some thoughts about the Department of Education cuts here. So, Tania, if you'd like to just introduce yourself for anyone who maybe hasn't seen other episodes, might not know who you are, and then, kind of talk briefly about your reaction to these massive cuts that the Trump administration is implementing in the Department of Education, why you're concerned about this, and then, I'll do my best to kind of offer maybe an alternative perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. So, as Sam says, my name is Tania. I'm currently pursuing a graduate degree in public policy, and I really follow this model called CUTE. I like to keep it as cute as possible, which just means clear, understandable, thematic, and encompassing, and which is what we're going to try to do with this conversation today. To keep it really balanced, try to explore the diverse perceptions that there is with the funding cuts and the layoffs we're seeing with the Department of Education. So, as we know, education is the foundation upon a prosperous society, right? And reducing support, though, to the department could undermine the efforts to provide quality education for all, which means we can see the foundation of our society shaken a little bit if the system does not have the support it requires. Not that it needs, but it requires, right? Um, off the My fear ultimately is that cutting funding for the Department of Education is going to have consequences for students, educators, and the future of a nation if we just undermine this, right? I fear that because the Department of Education plays a critical role in assuring fair and equitable access to high quality learning opportunities, if we reduce the resources this department has, we're going to see an even more decline in student achievement, right? So that's my fear. However, I also understand that this department needs to be efficient. I understand that the student achievement is declining. Our literacy scores, our math scores are not competitive amongst other countries. I understand that. I also understand that we need to be catering to student needs, and perhaps these cuts would encourage these departments to be more efficient. However, I don't see how that could be realistic when we're going from, like, for example, for over 4,000 workers to little over 2,000 workers now at the Department of Education. That's a big cut with a whole lot of programs. However, some of these programs are going to be moved to different areas, right? Like financial aid may be moved to the Treasury, right? But the Treasury's already so busy. They're already so behind. How are they going to add that to their workload, right? My fear is that cutting these resources could widen the education gap, right? And limit opportunities for growth and, ultimately harm the future of the workforce, right? However, in the pursuit of making this department efficient, perhaps we need to explore other alternatives that isn't just cutting the workforce. Maybe it's the funding part. Maybe we need to be able to measure efficiency in terms of funding, which is what Doge is trying to do, right? Like ensure efficiency, but I don't think cutting personnel is going to do that. Cutting people just means maybe less money being put forth, but we're not meeting our goals. Or if they do, I don't think that they're going to be big goals, right, Sam? Any thoughts on that so far?
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts. There are some things that I want to dig into more. I mean, just on the last point that you made there, I think that, you're right, and I think this is a pretty uncontroversial point to make, that cutting personnel doesn't have a massive effect on our price tag or our federal deficit, things like that. Like it makes a very small drop in the amount of money we spend in these various departments and agencies. Um, and if we want to make really big change to the price tag of these departments for the taxpayer, that requires congressional appropriations to be changed. That happens in the legislature. So there's only so much that the executive branch can do. But maybe they can pave the way for Congress to take action, or maybe pressure a Congress to take action and reduce appropriations if, say, they essentially starve out organizations like the Department of Education, put its functions to other existing departments, and thereby, reducing any incentive Congress would have to appropriate that money there, given that, it's not really going to do much of anything if the executive branch is doing everything it can to restrict, resources in so much as its authority allows. So I do think that that's a good point there, but I'm going to maybe contest a few things that you said, and just kind of like so we can dig into this a little more. There's a perspective that I've heard a lot out there, often by people who support the Trump administration, that the Department of Education is a prime example of bureaucratic bloat at the federal level, and that a lot of its functions, as you noted, could be transferred to other departments like the Treasury, or could be delegated to the states, or just aren't necessary. So, for one example, oftentimes when people worry about the Trump administration's policies here, they focus on OCR, the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education. They do a lot to enforce civil rights legislation in our education system. And there's a lot of concerns that eradicating or starving the department will obviously reduce our progress on civil rights issues. But the thing is, this particular office only investigates and considers, to my knowledge anyway, civil rights issues that relate to federal funding for programs. So they don't actually prosecute, say, in a criminal sense, violations of federal laws on civil rights. That happens mainly through other departments. But they just essentially determine, is this school in compliance with federal regulations on civil rights? If not, should we restrict funding? And federal funding itself, it's significant, but it makes up, to my awareness, about 10% of most state level school budgets. I think a lot of people look at that and they say, well, this seems to be fairly redundant if we already have, basically mechanisms in place for the federal government to prosecute discrimination. And why do we need this extra office to go in and do that? So that's just one example of how this might be a great deal of federal bloat, and how it might not require nearly as many resources as we're directing to it, including personnel resources, which, yes, maybe they don't require as much money as we spend on all of these sorts of massive programs that are handled through congressional appropriations, but still, it is money that costs the taxpayers something. And it creates a more burdensome federal bureaucracy, maybe. It might also give the federal government another avenue to pressure the states to, adopt maybe controversial policies or curriculums or educational practices that go against what those states would otherwise want to implement. So, if the federal government says, okay, we're only going to give you this 10% funding if you adhere to these, particular standards. And I think a lot of conservatives might worry that that's giving the federal government another route to basically step into what is, at the end of the day, a local or state level issue, or should be. Now, you did mention that transferring a lot of the essential functions of the Department of Education to other departments might not be, it might not work very well because, say, for instance, the Treasury Department is very behind, right, itself. And so giving it authority maybe over, like student aid for higher education, et cetera, might not work very well. So that I think that is a point worth considering and delving into here. So as I kind of stop my soliloquy here, like, what's your reaction to kind of the perspective that I've offered? This perspective that I'm hearing a lot from conservatives, I'm hearing a lot from Trump supporters. And as kind of an additional question, if you could elaborate on like what exactly in your view the Treasury Department is behind on, or why these other departments cannot take on this extra work. If you just have any additional thoughts there.
So the conservative perspective, so like the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education has a
Mm,
student focused lens, right? And this is the same office that sent these 60 letters to these higher education institutions, to telling them to protect Jewish students or we're going to cut your funding, right? So if this is the same department that we're cutting personnel from, how are we going to ensure that we're protecting Jewish students and universities per the Trump administration's now rules and regulations when it comes to funding, right? So that's
mm,
kind of, if we're cutting them, we're not really going to be meeting Trump demands right off the bat, right? Also, holding funding if they're non-compliant with what this administration needs, I fear sets a really harmful precedence, right? Because when Trump leaves office, we're gonna another person coming in. What if they switch everything? I think it's gonna become very flip floppy. We're gonna see a lot of inconsistencies with like holding higher education institutes accountable to meet funding needs. Like I think eventually, I don't think that's actually gonna come through. I think that's gonna be kind of confusing down the road. But in terms of, is Treasury the best? Are they the best suited to handle student financial aid? They use a lot of money, they grow through money. You would think so, but I fear that it's, how do I explain this? They're behind in the sense that I feel like they're also inefficient themselves. They can barely keep up with the other departments are spending, right? Like there's money that's being lost. I feel like this department's also going to get lost within the Treasury. I think when we have these hyper focused departments within these departments, like we have the Department of Education and we have this focus on financial aid, right? It's just focusing itself on how to make this resources accessible to students. How can we ensure that these students have all the information they need? How can we provide loan information, right? That's, they're hyper focusing on that. You move that to the Treasury, that has already so many other things within that, it's going to get lost in that, because unless you make a department within the Treasury about
mm,
financial aid, we may lose resources, right? We may lose the capability for students to reach out, asking about loans, asking about how can I pay for college, right? That's my fear when it comes to that. You're going to have to restructure the Treasury to try to figure out which personnel are going to go here. So that's what I mean, that they probably don't have the capacity to do that because it just means restructuring everything. It means setting different priorities per fiscal year, right? And it means that probably information is going to be lost, right? It's already such a hard hassle to even do the FAFSA application. Like the communication with that with the Biden administration last year was a pain for students,
mhm,
right? There were so many inaccuracies going on. The website wasn't working. People weren't getting their money in time. And that was already an issue. Put that with the Treasury, who already has an issue with corresponding communication, and they don't have support centers. Who are we going to call now if we don't have the Department of Education's department within financial aid, right? And then, yeah, so that's one thing. And I think that is a strong point, though, that um, Trump has about delegating, right? Because he wants to make the government as efficient as possible. And I understand that, and I recognize that we do need these programs to be efficient to set up our students right. And I understand that. I think that's a good point. And I think that if he wants to make our K through 12, for example, student focused, right? And when we're setting up educational like curriculum, we want these to focus on student needs. And when the government has a big say in it, it may be a very broad approach to it. They don't really know what these students need, but the states probably have a really good idea of what these students need. And then we move it more so towards them in setting up curriculum, which I think they already do, but this is more like Trump's perspective.
mhm,
Then well, maybe we'll be able to understand why student achievement is really declining. Maybe we would be able to see higher rates of literacy and math rates, right? And that's the goal. I think ultimately Trump wants to see students succeed, right? However, it's the approach that we're questioning. Is this the right approach? But then I also understand, what else is there? Like, we've always had this conversation, how do we improve? How do we improve? It's money, 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 but that hasn't fixed the problem. It hasn't fixed literacy rates. It hasn't fixed the math rates. It hasn't fixed it. We have brain drain even in higher education. So like, what can we do to fix this? Other than maybe setting up these cuts is the way to go, which is that's a logic that's coming from Trump. Like, this seems that the only option then to light, excuse my words, but it's gonna light a fire under their ass, and they're gonna be like, let me try to be as efficient as possible so I can keep my job, so I can keep funding, right? So that does make sense. However, I think when we see how these education layoffs are targeting financial aid offices, how they're targeting the civil rights offices and educational research teams, like, it makes me question, is this because he wants to make the department efficient, or because this is him, weaponizing his power to try to get these departments to align with what he wants, right? That's only my fear with it. I think this came from NPR, actually, how the education layoffs are disproportionately affecting them, affecting financial aid, civil rights, and education research teams, right? So, like, that's something to look more deeply about as to why them in particular are they being targeted. And also, if the goals of the Trump admin are to hold back funding if not compliant, why is one of the offices that do that being cut the most? Right? So maybe there's some inconsistencies going on there, Sam. But I probably have to look more into the whole Treasury to give you really specific things that they're lacking on. But I just don't think. I think if we were to move like financial aid towards the Treasury, that just means restructuring the Treasury as well, just to make sure that students and future students have the resources they need to apply for higher education.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing all that. There's kind of a lot to get to and dig into there. So I've tried in my notes here. My pen died partway through, so now I'm using a colored pencil. Um, but it seems to me that you kind of hit on maybe four main things here, and I'd like to address each of these in turn. And really try to kind of understand your perspective here. So the first note is that the Department of Education and all of its systems with OCR, with the financial aid, it's very student focused, and they've developed personnel and systems that emphasize education. If we transfer this over to the Treasury, maybe we don't have those same resources or expectations or norms in place. Maybe we don't have the same level of expertise. And that could be very problematic. Maybe a lot gets lost in the shuffle. There could be, especially in the near term, a lot of students who are looking for aid falling through the cracks or not getting their aid in time for, attending university on whatever timeline they have. That sort of thing. Then maybe one could respond to this. A lot of the personnel will still be the same. Like, we've gotten rid of about half the Department of Education, but the people that we're keeping, they're still going to be there. They'll still have the same expertise, a lot of the same systems and training. They're just going to be organized under the Treasury, so that they'll maybe just report to the department head there. But I guess maybe the worry then becomes, well, is this just kind of a semantic issue? Like, what does it matter if it's under Department of Education or Department of Treasury if it's doing the same thing? So, at that point, like, why is say the Trump administration, but also people who are arguing against this, making such a big deal out of this issue? If the people are going to be the same, a lot of the systems are going to be the same. It's just like cut back, right? So maybe the real issue and what's being criticized here is the cuts in and of themselves, as opposed to changing things over the Treasury. I don't know. We'll see how it shakes out. We'll see what happens. But of course, you are right there that making these transitions can involve a lot of personnel management difficulties, and students might bear the brunt of that burden, and a lot can get lost there. So I do think that's an important consideration, that's a possibility to consider. And yeah, no, I think that kind of fills out maybe where you're coming from a little more. I mean, did I represent that first point accurately? Is that kind of your concern here?
Yeah, my work was overworked, underfunded. Yeah.
Hmm.
So like my fear is that because of all these cuts back, yeah, you're gonna have people who are still in that department, but they're gonna have now more work to do, which just means to less efficient work, right?
Mm,
How can we balance efficiency with a smaller workforce, but the workload remains the same?
mm, yeah, yeah. And I guess maybe because a lot of these cuts, I think that point applies to the financial aid offices. You know, they're a lot of those systems are going to remain in place just with less people, at least to my knowledge. But with OCR and with a lot of these research divisions, it seems like those operations are just kind of stopping. So that workload, I don't know, will be transferred over. I think that the Trump administration just kind of wants to cease a lot of their operations there. So I don't know. We'll see exactly how this plays out. But maybe to get to some of the other points you mentioned here. The second point is that you understand that maybe lighting a fire under a lot of people within the federal government and maybe even states who are looking for funding with this sort of efficiency driven and very maybe lean approach that the Trump administration and Doge are wanting to take here that can improve efficiency just in changing the culture, kind of changing the norms and expectations and really making sure people are on top of demonstrating their progress, kind of tangible results, etc. And maybe that's not happening as well as it should in the current government. I mean, I guess my question before we get to the final 2 points here is, in your view, how do we encourage that sort of culture without doing what Trump and Musk are doing, without like really making some dramatic cuts, kind of shocking the system, and putting people in this situation where a culture of efficiency and demonstrating tangible progress, and kind of I guess really advocating for an individual's position and their work then becomes the norm. Like how do we achieve that and get the gains from it without, in your view, engaging in this policy of dramatic cutting that you worry a lot about and as a whole don't seem to agree with?
Yeah, I mean, that's a question a lot of educational policy experts are trying to answer themselves.
Yep.
Because obviously, I think efficiency is key, of course. Of course it is. Like we've, we have approached education in a market type of way, so we want our return of investment back. It's a lot of our taxpayer money is going to here. So of course we want to see something come out of it. And we're not really seeing that with student achievement declining. So how do we improve that without these cuts? How do we improve that without taking away funding or reducing funding? And I think ultimately that just means starting from the bottom, right? Trying to understand what is our educational goals now. What is higher education's role in everything? What is public education's goal in everything? We have to sort of probably reframe what our approach has been and start from there. And then I don't know, it's like it's really hard because I think just from a student perspective, I'd be like, if we get people on the ground to really understand what students are struggling with, then we can target it there. But that means extra money, more personnel to go out in the streets to really evaluate these schools, right? Um, and that's going to
Well,
be hard to do. Yeah. So like I really don't have an idea. However, I think if there was a plan on what the cuts would look like and how these departments can restructure, I think that would ease a lot of my confusion or a lot of my concern. Because right now all we're seeing is cuts, 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 cuts. And we see those workers who are cut being like, well, I don't know what's going to happen there. Or you see current workers who don't disclose their name because they're afraid of retaliation from Trump administration saying, hey, our department's kind of, screwed over. We don't know what to do. It's a lot of more work for us. We're not going to be as efficient anymore. Not that they were in the first place. But it's a lot of concern. They don't know what they're going to do. They don't know how they're going to operate. Of course, I'm going to be kind of like, oh, was this the right deal? But we won't know until we know. And we
mhm,
won't know until we know it's effective. But I think maybe removing this sort of market lens we have placed on education could get us in a place where we can understand what we're lagging in, right? But that's more of a liberal perspective on what we could do. Now, I do think that Trump has a good idea of efficiency, but I just don't know if that efficiency lens is going to work for this particular department and it's going to have that positive impact that he wants to have for our education systems.
Yeah, well, I think that I mean the main goal here, kind of overall, and I think this is fairly bipartisan, is what we can do to improve student outcomes. What we can
Mhm.
do to bring the academic performance of the U.S. up, improve the welfare of students, etc. Um, in addition to maybe the more partisan goals of reducing the federal government or ensuring more, um, I guess, constant or consistent policies, especially related to anti-discrimination in education across states. Like I think those issues are where we start getting into partisan territory. But
Yeah.
just focusing on the subject of academic performance, and I think this is the third thing that you had hit on there in your initial comment, and that's what effect is this actually going to have on like the policy solutions themselves? um, because a lot of the offices that are being cut in the Department of Education focus on research, and these are people who do actually go on the ground. They go into classrooms. They try to understand what's going on. Exactly what you were describing there, and try to research ways to improve academic performance there. Now, you can make the argument, well, evidently they haven't been very successful because the United States isn't performing very well. It's somewhat middling. But I mean, maybe that would just take time, or maybe they were on the brink of something, or maybe the process got holed up somewhere else. They were proposing all these great ideas, but then states wouldn't do them. Who knows exactly where things broke down. So I don't want to place blame too quickly there. But this creates, I think, an interesting dynamic between conservatives who really want to emphasize, okay, we need state authority here. We need to give as much power to the states on education as possible, which frankly they already have extensive power in education. They, as you said, create the curriculums, they implement them. Essentially, the federal government has power in withholding funding, if they don't comply with certain federal goals or something like that. But that's pretty much it. And then they also, federal government also administers the financial aid for higher education. But otherwise, it is already handled by the states. So I guess I wonder what, like, how is this actually going to tangibly result in improved student outcomes if we go through these cuts? What's the actual effect going to be on student performance? How does this play into that? Or is the argument, and this is kind of returning to maybe my initial presentation of the what I perceive to be the conservative perspective here, and that's that the Department of Education really is just fairly useless. And we can transfer a lot of these powers to other departments, just kind of returning to that point there. And if we want to talk about improving student outcomes, we need to talk about what to do on the state level and policies to implement there. And this, the Department of Education issue maybe really isn't about improving student outcomes. Maybe it is just about reducing the size of the federal government. And then when we get into the policy debate on improving student outcomes, that happens on the state level. So I mean, I don't know. I guess just kind of returning to your perspective here, what do you see the Department of Education doing that is either essential or um, like really can't be transferred to another department? I mean, you mentioned earlier, like transferring to the Treasury, financial aid matters, things could get lost, etc. But, maybe at least in the long term, there's a way to ensure that that is adequately handled under the Treasury, that, systems are developed. So maybe there's short-term costs and people falling through the cracks, but eventually we're able to build up the system again, but this time with less federal departments. So maybe outside of what can be transferred conceivably, is there something that you think the Department of Education does that the Trump administration is looking to just kind of abolish and not include in the federal government anymore that we need, and that it kind of, I guess, justifies the department's continued existence? Like do you just see anything there?
Yeah, I mean, the two right off the bat, and you mentioned this earlier, was just the educational research. It's like the education report card, that apartment is done for. It's already
Mm,
gone, right? I also think, I mean, the Office of Civil Rights is always going to be there in in education because it's, civil rights. It's always going to be there. I'm not really afraid of that. I'm more so concerned of the capacity they would have to ensure that each student is being taught fairly and treated fairly in schools. But those are the two main ones that I'm more so concerned about. It's like, are we still going to have like state funded research, right, when it comes to education, right? Really understanding what's wrong with our education system, right? But we've had that and we didn't get anywhere. So I also understand like maybe they weren't doing as good as a job. But I don't know. And that's a really good question. Like, what basically you're asking me, what do they do that's so unique that justifies them having their own department?
yeah,
And
or that kind of
yeah,
invalidates the perspective that, oh, this is just a useless department, other things can do this. Let's cut on federal bureaucracy and get rid of this.
yeah, and and that's a hard question because very easily financial aid can go to like the small business bureau, right? It
Yeah.
can go straight into there too. I just think when you have specialized focuses with time dedicated solely for those things and I, that's a really good question, Sam. Actually, I really have not thought about that. What makes it so unique? But we've had this apartment since like what the
70s, I think.
I think since the 80s, since the 1980s. So that's all we've known. We did this because our students were lacking. We were so behind, so we had to make a department
Mm,
so we could get ahead of the game. So that's all we've known so far. So I'm not really sure how they didn't before 1980s or before the 70s, right? How we approach education before that. It's always been part of the states. So also like this back to the states narrative we get from Trump, it's already there. Like
mm,
it's already been there. But I think if we didn't do cuts, if we didn't do cutting to funding as well, we could have done what he wanted, which is saying, hey, if you don't meet these educational goals, we're going to cut funding, right? We're
mm.
going to take away funding a little bit until you reach those goals, right? It's sort of consequence. I think probably that could have been a good one, but also it kind of puts lower income schools are in a bad place because they don't score well. And if they continue not to score well, they're gonna not get funding. But that's also something we already do. Also, we already fund based on performance. So that's a really hard question, Sam. Actually,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't really have an answer for it.
Yeah, well, I think, it is a tough question. But maybe the response you offered there was just, having a dedicated department to this issue creates that specialization and allows people to really hone in on these policy issues that if they were involved with a broader department and subject to that department's resource allocation and management, which is focused on all these other issues, then maybe those, policy subjects like education don't get as much time, at least on the federal level. So maybe there's something to be said there. Let's turn briefly to I think the fourth horn of kind of what you were talking about in your initial comment there. And that is, you mentioned this idea of weaponization. And can you kind of go back? I just want to make sure that I was understanding kind of what you were saying there. Was this a concern that the Trump administration is going to, kind of use and is using or will continue to use Doge and other arms of executive authority to, in a political sense, weaponize a lot of these agencies or something like that? Like, and how is that different than maybe the executive branch just exercising its constitutional authority? And also norms that have been developed over centuries of just kind of controlling personnel and the functions and operations of the executive branch and its agencies. So if we could just return to that point so I can make sure I'm understanding what you were saying there.
Yeah, so that's a narrative that I saw being explored from the left, how this is an indicator of like what not really indicator of Trump's overreach because he could very much do this in he can even pass an order and Congress just has to accept it. So this is very much like in a way constitutional, it's very legal. It's not illegal, so he's not doing anything wrong in that sense. What I think they're trying to get at from this perspective is that is he doing this because he does want to see students improve? He wants to see continued growth, or is he doing this because he like ran his platform of bringing schools back to states, right? And this really is a false narrative, but like he promised that, and this is showing that he's doing that. So then his supporters are going to be like, "Oh, good, he did it, even though it's already been done." But he also promised efficiency, and maybe this for them is efficiency. So I think from them, from the left, would see this as him just doing too much, for lack of better words, just doing too much. But I mean, he said he was gonna do it.
Mhm.
it's I'm trying to understand like how that perspective works as well, because it's more so like the perception of him that I think is fueling the most negativity towards this particular action. I've seen a lot of liberal perspectives say this is because this is like authoritarianship, but this is very much within like his rights to do this. It doesn't seem illegal. However, it is concerning that most of these departments happen to be a financial aid office, happen to be of the OCR, and happen to be of the educational research departments. That is a bit concerning because it seems targeted at that point when they're the ones who are getting hit the most. You wonder, oh, is this because he hates DEI so much and OCR looks and ensures students are being treated fairly based on their race, gender identity, right? Is that just another take down DEI initiative? And the educational research also, if like states are going to look into that too, so it makes you question, is this just him trying to go against the quote unquote woke agenda? Right? So that's where that concern comes from. But is he doing anything illegal? No, really, he really isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he, as far as like, I do know like firing a bunch of probationary, employees throughout the federal government. That might have been illegal. It remains to be seen exactly how the legality plays out. Court ordered the reinstatement a lot of those employees, and like you can, get rid of them. These employees who were like just recently hired or who were recently promoted, things like that. The probationary employees there that have been kind of cut from numerous agencies, including the Department of Education. Um, but we'll kind of see exactly how all of that plays out. Because as I said, you can fire these people, but maybe the way that it was done didn't adhere to law and procedure. So maybe there was something illegal there.
Yep.
There's also, I know, with the Department of Education in particular, I know a bunch of lawsuits have been filed claiming that the Trump administration, through these like roughly 50% personnel cuts, have effectively dismantled the department.
Okay.
And you can't actually dismantle it or abolish it or disband it entirely without congressional approval.
Yeah.
So, we'll see how that plays out, whether their argument succeeds there. If that's the case, then, once again, maybe something illegal was done. But I mean, that's all still fairly early, and I don't have the expertise. I'm only a prospective law student. I haven't actually studied this, really thoroughly yet. So, we'll kind of see how that turns out. But as far as the basic idea of cutting these agencies and departments dramatically, you are right. There's, that's within the scope of executive power. But, maybe there are certain issues with the motives. That's difficult to determine. Another nuance here that I think is interesting is it seems to me that in rhetoric, things like DEI and these partisan issues are connected very explicitly to increasing student performance. So maybe in Trump's mind, these things are kind of one and the same. We want to increase student performance, so we need to reduce focus on things like DEI, and we need other policies. Um, so yeah, I don't know. It's a very complex issue how this all plays, and kind of like plays together, and whether it represents weaponization, authoritarianism, etc., or maybe something a little more mundane. Maybe, and if you have any other thoughts, we can return to this topic. But I just remembered the thing that I wanted to talk about earlier that I'd forgotten to kind of mention there, and that is something that I personally remain undecided on. I'm not sure exactly where I stand here. Um, I see a lot, especially in conversations around Doge, this idea that, okay, we need to, we can do a lot of this, like cutting, improving efficiency, but we need to take it more slowly, right? We need to be more methodical. We need more discussion. But then I see this alternative perspective that if we were to go through that process, a lot of things get bogged down in bureaucracy and in never-ending policy discussions, etc. And maybe a shock to the system, like Trump and Musk and Doge coming in, making massive cuts, and then basically, just forcing other federal agencies and or the states to pick up the slack and, really forcing these institutions to identify and prioritize what is most efficient or what is most important, that could create more long-term gains for the American people because we're kind of jumping the gun on forcing some of these solutions and reducing federal bureaucracy that would have otherwise taken maybe decades to really trim down. So I don't know. What's your thought on kind of that dichotomy, like between, okay, we need to shock to the system and we need quick change because otherwise things are going to get bogged down and the American people are still going to be, dealing with this massive bloated federal government and the costs it incurs when they could have, should we have taken the shock to the system like we are now, not suffered those costs and that bloat. Or do you think, no, we do need a more methodical approach that's more valuable here?
Yeah, so methodological, I can't pronounce that.
Yeah.
That approach, then or a shock to the system. You know what? I think the shock to the system created so much fear, anxiety, and confusion that creates fear, right? So I think because it was so abrupt and kind of confusing, just leads to more, like, at least just leads to fear and uncertainty. I think if it was more thought out, as in saying, this is the plan, this is why we're doing these cuts, this is what we think is going to happen, and without this narrative that we're taking down DEI or we're taking away all the stuff, I think it would have eased fear, anxiety, and confusion. Right? I think that approach, these are two different approaches in terms of style, right? They're still doing the same thing, but this the style in which they're doing it, the approach. I think if it were more, like, not, I wouldn't say even slower, I would just say if it was more laid out as to the reasoning, it was a bit more clearer as opposed to these little tweets we see or little spurs of press conferences. I think would ease the anxiety that a lot of those who work in the department have and supporters of the Department of Education have, right? So I do think they did a more of a methodologic. I can't pronounce. I don't know why I'm having such a problem saying that word. Say that word for me, Sam.
Methodological.
Approach either.
Yeah.
um that I think it would have eased anxiety when it came to these cuts, right? So I think that's really it. I
Yeah.
think if they did that instead, obviously they're still at the end of the day cutting, not when I say cutting funding immediately, but it's still doing what Trump wants. I still think would have eased the confusion, anxiety that we see coming from the left and
Yeah.
supporters of higher education. Even there's even like conservatives or Republicans who don't really support this, right? Because they recognize that the Department of Education has a specialized mission, right? And they have specific coordination and focus, right? And that it is support for the states and localities that it's necessary to have this as an individual department, right?
Mhm.
That by putting it into a different one, we could see a great reduction of support for schools, right? So that's their fear. But they're saying, but we put a lot of money into this and we're
Mhm.
still not ahead of the game. So what do we do then?
Yep.
And then we see this as the result. Because what did Biden do? He put a lot more money into it, and we
Mhm.
still didn't get good grades. We haven't recovered from the COVID brain drain. We have yet to recover our math scores, our reading scores from pre-COVID levels. We're still playing catch up, and it's been like 5 years, right? So like, what can you do then, right? So like, I'm interested to see how this plays out, but I recognize how this is causing a lot of uncertainty over the department, which could make people a bit more anxious, and not anxious in a way like, oh my god, they're sensitive. No, like anxious as in what's going to happen to their school. Is
Yeah.
their school to get funding? Are the students going to have resources? that's where the anxiety comes from.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe there is kind of a compromise here where we can accomplish a lot of the same sorts of things in much the same time, but if more prep work had been done, right? If more like explicit work and here's the plan, here's what we're cutting, here's why, as opposed to kind of keeping everyone in suspense. So maybe that's something that, in a bipartisan sense, we can kind of like get behind, I guess, and just kind of analyzing what should have been done here and what can be done better in the future. I don't know. Maybe there are some conservatives or people who support the Trump administration who would disagree even with that. I'm not sure, but in any case, Tania, thank you for this discussion. You've kind of broadened my horizons on a number of these issues. I enjoy kind of the interplay of ideas here and really just trying to dig into what are you seeing on these issues and how can that improve or inform my perspective. So thanks for that. And are there any final words you want to leave us with, or do you think we've covered it?
But yeah, I think we covered it, but I do like, I want to make sure we understand like both parties want to see our education system be improved because it's obvious that we aren't doing what we need to do to support our students. But I think the approaches is what divides them, right? But there's
Mhm.
similarities in their approaches that could be brought to the table and could actually get where we want to, right?
Mhm.
But if only they can talk. But I know we said before, like it's hard to get them to talk, right? But I think there's ways they could have worked together that didn't create such a shock to the system and created such anxiety,
Mhm.
But obviously, I want this to work. I want what Trump did, even though it was such a shock. I want it to work because I care about the students. I think we all care for the students. We want this to work. I'm not gonna be like, I hope it fails. No, because that means it's gonna hurt me.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of people saying like, oh, I hope this like bites them in the ass. I hope not. I hope it does the damn
Mhm.
job. We need to have some type of a little bit of hope. And maybe that's what makes me a bit a moderate right there where I'm like, I want it to work. I see why he wants this to work.
Mhm.
So let's hope it works. But I think ultimately I think everyone wants to support our schools, but we have to figure out how to work together to get there.
Mhm. Yeah. Yep. No, thank you for that, Tanya. And yeah, I mean, kind of the solutions focus. Let's sit down at the table and figure something out. Dialogue. It's just maybe that happens to a greater degree behind closed doors, but at the very least, what is represented in media is certainly not that. So I don't know. We'll kind of see what happens. We'll see how these things develop. And thank you again for sharing your perspective and for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you, Sam.
All right. And for our, anyone who's listening to this podcast, especially if you're watching this on YouTube, we are of course curious as to kind of your perspectives on these issues. Anything you want to add? Anything we missed? I'm sure there's plenty of evidence, data, arguments that we didn't even touch on. So if you have anything to kind of increase I guess robustness of this conversation, to enrich what we've said so far, like please, share that in any way you see fit. Of course, we're maintaining the respectful attitude that we hope we encouraged and have demonstrated today. So, in any case, thank you again, Tanya, and I think that's where we're going to end.
Yeah, yeah. Any tips on how to go over my stutter so I can say that methodology? I can say that without stuttering. If anyone can give
I
me tips for that, I would
I don't
appreciate
know.
it.
It's rough. It's a rough one. Just do method O, like like I don't know, big O tires or something. Method O, and then just say logical at the end.
Methodological. I
There
literally
you go.
it like triggers my stutter so bad, but
Yeah,
let
yeah.
me
No,
try.
it's rough. All right. Thanks all.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.